Well, if you don't mind me sitting, I'd like to first of all introduce my study is based on Stanley Cohen. Who knows the name Stanley Cohen? Yeah, good, everybody. He wrote about moral panics and also a book called States of Denial. And I think they're both very important because that's what we are dealing with, denial and moral panics. I
can move the slide for you.
Yeah. Good, thanks.
Good.
Yes.
Well, something at the end. I'm useful. Thank you.
Well, this is sort of my introduction. I'm an activist and a researcher, and I would emphasize the word activist. My professor was Martti Grönfors, who's a member. How many people know him?
Yeah.
Great. Great. Was a real activist and who engaged me in the European group 32 years ago. I wrote my dissertation on the sickness label of homosexuality in '97, and I first talked at the European group meeting in Hytiälä, Finland, the very summer that then the AIDS panic really hit Finland and the rest of Europe. Then we presented, together with Martti, our analysis of the panic in Cardiff in '84. Then I was invited to Australia to do research on moral panics, because Australia is a very interesting collection of different kinds of states. One of the worst states in the world is Queensland, which is a very authoritarian place, almost comparable to the former Soviet Union. But then there were very, very liberal states, New South Wales, South Australia, where I worked. Okay, yes. I take the example of Queensland as an extreme example of a moral panic. First of all, homosexuality was illegal. There was it was criminalized with, I think it was, well, many years of hard labor. The leading political party was called National Party, which resembles those parties we are seeing in Western Europe now, today. We get all kinds of populist movements, which I find frightening. Do you have in Estonia, do you have these populist parties?
I think it's an Estonian here right now.
Well, anyway, the way the moral panic was started, or actually built up, was that there was a case of 3 babies having received infected blood, which of course is a terrible thing. But the way it was made into a moral panic was not that fact alone, but the way the National Party used it. One example is that they waited for several months until the Australian federal elections. Then they published it. And so Joe Bjelke Pedersen was the premier of that state. And he used words like, "We are in a state of siege by communists." His party used terms like "disgusting, dirty perverts, poison our blood banks." This kind of information or propaganda really scared everybody and turned the situation into a panic. They used terms like "dirty perverts who threaten innocent Christians." There's always the contradiction between innocent Christians and perverts. I interviewed Ken Donald of the Queensland Department of Health, and I noticed that in his office it looked like a prison cell with metal bars in front of the windows, so that no perverts could escape from the windows when being interrogated by him. So that took several years. I was in Australia in '86 doing this research. Several years, maybe 3 years, of this moral panic and fear continued. There were different kind of fears circulating the globe. First, fear of bad blood, then fear of mosses, as they call mosquitoes in Australia, then fear of people getting infections from the chalices in the church and having sacraments. And there too was the fear that dirty perverts are a threat to innocent Christians. Well, anyway, Neil Blewett was the federal health minister at that time in Australia, and he has some sensible ideas. He appointed NACAIDS, which is a federal broad-based committee, and started to coordinate information and action. And what is, in my opinion, most important, he appointed a well-known journalist, health journalist, Aito Batros, who had written to various magazines about health things. And she started to do public education. So I think that's the most important thing we learned from Australia. And then we brought the ideas back to Finland. And again, we contacted at that time we had a social affairs minister, Vappu Taipale, who was a very sensible, wise woman minister of health. She even discontinued her summer vacation and contacted all actors, clinicians, researchers, gay rights groups, blood bank officials. We even asked for help from friendly leaders of the church, because we realized this is a real bad situation. Now we need help from anybody who is willing to help us. Actually, the Archbishop was the first person I contacted at that time, and also Martti Lindqvist, a doctor of theology and an ethicist. Because we wanted to have people who have some sense of ethics and what is right and what is wrong. And then we started to produce information. We appointed a female health journalist who had been receiving prizes from her books about cancer. And she contacted the important, self-important male doctors who made money, power, and prestige. She interviewed these people, wrote them up in a very fluent way, and then everything was put in a book called AIDS in a Matter-of-Fact Way. This includes 100 pages of Christina Tuorma's factual articles. Then Martti Lindqvist is one who wrote, and Martti Grönfors wrote from a sociologist's point of view. I wrote from a sociologist's point of view, and I would say this was one of the decisive things that finally brought down the panic and gave information instead. Last year, two young health journalists, Antti Järvi and Hanna Nikkanen, updated the situation in Finland in a book called Quarantine, although we never needed a quarantine. But they sort of sum up the whole fight and come to the same conclusion that we were actually very lucky in getting responsible people, health journalists, who cooled or dismantled the panic. I come to the last slide, which is sort of the situation today, the practical, down-to-earth situation today, which shows in a very, very clear way how authoritarian circumstances lead to terrible, terrible, life-threatening situations. There you have this is the prevalence of HIV infections in 2010. I'm proud to say that Finland is the cleanest society, whereas the St. Petersburg area is one of the dirtiest. So-called Leningrad Oblast it's unbelievable. And then Estonia, I know that the mechanism because behind these terrible figures is that there's the intravenous drug
Drug use?
yeah, drug use, yes, epidemics. Yeah. But anyway, when I studied how HIV was handled in the Soviet media, there was, as Stanley Cohen put it, a state of denial. In the Karelian Republic, they said that we don't have women who have light shoes. The light-shoed woman is in Finnish somebody who has bad morals. In the Soviet Union, we didn't have light-shoed women, and now they pay for it. They pay for the sins of double standard of morality. A very instructive figure is that Sweden has 4.9, which is relatively high, higher than Finland. And the explanation to that is that in the beginning, a medical doctor from Eastern Germany started to publish really scary and authoritarian articles in Sweden, financed by American Republican finance books. There was a terrible moral crisis in Sweden in the beginning. A scare campaign. Whereas in Finland, after the first scary months or years, we managed to reach agreement with government officials, and we luckily had some very good ministers of social affairs, ethicists, priests, and so on. So after all, I think Finland is a good example of what can be done when you really start working on and cooperating to dismantle moral panics. I have called this my winter war. Preventive victory is a linguistic invention of the Finns. When we lose wars against the Soviet Union, we call them preventive victories. Because Finland has never been occupied by the Soviet Union. We lost the war, but we remained independent. Do I have time?
Yeah, you still have more than 5 minutes, almost 10. So.
Well, I would like to start the discussion now. Do you have any comments on one thing? I would like to somebody to explain that why is there such a huge difference between the attitudes and the amount of denial in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union.
Please. When I first studied in the Soviet Union in 1987, AIDS, or speed as they called it, was regarded as a capitalist illness.
Yeah.
And that's what they called it. So, and the figures you've given here, I know Bill Butler did a lot of work on transmission through, intravenously, but also in prisons, and what the condition of prisons and the denial, the ideological labelling, of HIV. You're absolutely right. It's every possible state of denial possible. And the fact that also, would you call it light shoes?
Yes, light shoes women.
Light shoes women. Again, all these denials, even under, Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, it was still kind of prevalent. And of course, we know the issues now with homosexuality from, Putin's point of view has been there really from 2000 onwards. So it's everything is in place for this to be a terrible, terrible situation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask Paddy a question?
Yeah.
Can you just say a bit more about how this is a catalyst disease? What's the...
No, it was that was what they called it in the mid-80s, because anything that was negative that happened in the Soviet Union was to do with capitalism. So in a way, it was, it's a kind of it was a re-emergence of the kind of Stalinist discourse that you'd had, 20, 30 years previously. So that was why this disease.
But I think it's even more to it because, first of all, this is the land where the sun never set down, right? So it has to be sunny. So that's first. Second, it's of course very much related to the attitude towards homosexual, which in Russia it's openly said that you cannot promote homosexuality, it's a crime. So it's a way to come back to punish homosexuality. And the real men are never get this disease because it's only getting through the homosexuality.
Yeah.
Third, it's very much related to the attitude to religion. So if you get it, it is the punishment for the things you are doing. And in that sense, both Catholicism and communism are having a lot of common. Fourth, if you want to prevent it, you have to do the sexual education, the things you are saying, that the children should learn. Forget it. You want to sexualize our children. You want to change our children into pervert. And they should be pure, And that's exactly the same way of talking both in Soviet Union, in Russia, and in Rome. It's the same kind of discourse. Fifth, prevention costs. And prevention would demand from you to say openly, we've got a problem with drugs. And this is the country where we drink vodka. So only pervert do other things. For proper people, drink vodka. And drugs are forbidden. So in order to prevent it, you would have to say, okay, it's forbidden, but I have to give the needles, right? Impossible. So better to not to say. Fifth, or I don't know which one in addition, it costs to treat. In Poland, we've got fantastic program for everyone who is identified HIV patient. Got it, he, from the very beginning till the very end. But this going on around the group of people which are identified, and we do everything not to identify the new one. So it looks like there is a beautiful program for those established, and we do everything to shut the others out. And in Russia, they do it from the very beginning, from the open stand. There is no money for treating HIV patients. Another element, lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge. This is disease of homosexual, this is disease of perverts. It does not attack women. Next things, if you are a real man, you don't use contraceptives, you don't use condoms, right?
Yes.
So you pay even more to ladies to have the sex without condoms. And then you come back to your girlfriend, wife, lover, and you continue, so it's spreading. It's a lot of elements, plus it must come to a point. They have a trouble that the people are dying, but they see that the people are dying because of abusing alcohol. They don't see that the people are dying also because of other sicknesses. And the truth is,
there's much more people right now dying of, again, pneumonia, yeah, than the other stuff. So they've got bigger problems than that.
I think
would say.
I'm going to say on top of that though, on the drugs thing, to the intravenous, that since the invasion of Afghanistan, there's a lot of work done with the Allies. They turned away from the heroin trails that went up through Central Asia. There's been a massive increase in heroin addiction in Russia. They use this 12-step program that is completely ineffective. So again, that's kind of foreign policy linked to this kind of epidemic of heroin use that never, because of the access again through the stands and from Afghanistan. So I think that's another.
But they have to, yes, but they will not bring it up because that would show that really being in Afghanistan was not a heroic, patriotic thing.
It wasn't to do with the Russians in Afghanistan. It was to do with the 2002 invasion of
But
the
there's a lot
Allies.
of Russian people who are also abusing drugs because of, those who
Oh yeah,
were
absolutely. The veterans. Yeah.
veterans.
But the heroin trail just completely exploded 2003-4, and that's been denied by the Americans that they put the lid on that. But that's actually released a lot of heroin up through, it was Pakistan and Kazakhstan. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question about looking at the situation in Finland and Russia, that we had a law initiative recently about that paperless immigrants should have a right to certain health care. But that law didn't pass, and one of the big fears was that all those Russian HIV patients will then come to Finland to take care of their HIV. So what do you think of, you follow this discussion that went on, and this law really didn't pass, but actually constitutional lawyers say that our law actually allows everybody anyway. It's in our fundamental rights, but that's another discussion.
Yes,
We didn't
yes.
need the law, that they have the fundamental right anyway. But I don't know if maybe this is just a comment, not a question, but you have some.
Well,
So
that's typical scare tactics of the so-called real Finns party, which is, I think, disgusting. I feel ashamed of being Finn today. Well, I don't know. Could it be possible that millions of people from the St. Petersburg area come to Finland? I don't know.
That was one big argument against
Yes,
the law.
yes.
May I say something, because this reminds me something about Italy. In Italy we have this law that basic health care is provided for everyone, no matter if they are legal or illegal. And we had this law since long time, so there is no reason that you don't need to have an assurance. I mean, health care is for everybody. And there was this argument that this will cost millions. There were people just moving and coming for our healthcare system. Nothing of this never happened. So it's really all the time the same things, no? It's the only, it changed maybe the field, it changed the actors, but it's all the time the same arguments. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to the safe sex issue. When I started to study in Edinburgh, it was the time where in Britain they had gravestones to show that when you have sex, especially if you're gay, this is what happens, you will die. And that didn't work. And I think it would lead to that kind of HIV population. And then, because they saw that didn't work, they had to change their strategy, and they started to promote to use condoms and to also have, interestingly, non-genital or non-anal sex. So basically fetishism became embraced, and part of that became then maybe a motivation for many people to engage, interestingly, in consensual SM and fetishist behaviors or practices. And well, of course, it then meant that we have less HIV problems. So I thought, there's a bit of a parallel. So it was just a comment, no question.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, last night we saw the Grim Reaper coming to our party, and Australians studied the effect of scare campaigns. There was a Grim Reapers campaign, which scared everybody. It was found out that people just don't change their behavior because of scare tactics. But it's so easy for politicians to start scare tactic.
I was just going to add to that as well, levels of trust between communities and clinicians or NGOs, and the fact that, that if there are to be things like needle exchange schemes, amnesty and so on and so forth, there was also a long struggle, if you like, to decriminalise that zone of activities. And certainly I lived in London during that period, where I was in a community where there was a lot of IV use, and people who were very worried that they were HIV positive but would not go to seek medical help because rumour had it, whether true or not, that the GPs were obliged to report any case. And I have no doubt in my mind, and I know anecdotally, that there were individuals who did not seek treatment and did not seek diagnosis for that reason. So it was out of this hard-won lesson, actually, that certain zones and activities had to be decriminalised, that trust relations had to be built up between communities and perhaps NGOs, that there had to be a retreat of the kind of statutory, regulatory regime from those practices as well. And naturally enough, I think one might also be able to look at that map and see whether or not that capacity is there, possibly very unlikely in Russia in comparison with some of the other countries up there.
What we were really lucky is that some of us are, for instance, the Bishop of Helsinki sent greetings to this conference through me, because I was in her election group.
Regarding pharmaceutical advancement, I don't know, I'm just wondering whether it has progressed so that life expectancy actually has been prolonged, and who is behind the pharmaceuticals? Is it companies that provide those drugs or treatment for HIV positives?
I checked that from the experts in that field. Today, they say that the life expectancy of an HIV positive person in Finland is the same as in the general population, provided that the person takes the drugs prescribed.
And who is providing those drugs? The company?
Sorry?
The pharmaceutical company, is it American, but or I don't know.
Do you know the company that provides the medication? If it's a Finnish or
I must admit I don't know the details of that.
Okay.
But anyway, it's covered by the national health insurance.
But I think one of the, I don't know the company, but I think one of the struggles around retroviral drugs was about reducing the price,
Yeah.
right?
We were just.
And that struggle was won in some parts of the West. But it's interesting, of course, that struggle isn't even taking place around many of the other, like malaria, tuberculosis diseases which kill millions of people. So this was, in many ways, a disease of an illness of the West, right? And there was a struggle against the pharmaceutical industry. The struggle was kind of won in a way, but diseases which kill people every second that we speak, right?
Yes.
Not an issue.
There's that very, very interesting movement in India about the columns and making generic substitutes at a fraction of the price.
But they repatent it, yeah. They play around with patent laws, the companies, so that it's very. I mean, they've won it now, but it's very difficult to. It will be challenged constantly.
Oh, can I come back to the
Yeah, you still. We have time until 12:30, so.
12th? Okay. Talking about the Russian situation, I was invited to a scientific conference in Moscow in 1990, because at that time there was the Gorbachev, perestroika, and I was known as a radical sociologist in Finland. That's why I was invited as one speaker to the Moscow conference in 1990. And that was, I have very good memories of that conference, because at that time there was a known Russian sociologist called Igor Gon, who wrote about these things in Russian from the Russian academic perspective. And in the same conference there were KGB officers who came every night to fetch me for interrogation. I mean, in a friendly way. They wanted to know everything that's happening in the Western democracies. And one result of this conference was that the disease label of homosexuality was deleted in 3 years after that. So that something can happen even in semi-authoritarian societies. And I'm just waiting for something to happen in Russia, because the present situation is terrible.
If I may ask a very quick question, but the situation is in Russia is always the same, or is becoming worse, or basically nothing changed in the last, I don't know, 30 years?
Oh, there was a lot of change in 1990. Homosexuality was decriminalized. And even in the conference, the alcohol use was restricted to 1 bottle per table. So my hope is that something, anything.
We do the same for the next conference. Okay? So don't laugh.
So things may change. I place my hopes on that.
Okay, someone else? So I think we close the session.
Thank you.